What do you get if you pair an Intel Core i9-14900HX with an RTX 4070 and stick it in a 15-inch laptop chassis? The IONICO 15 from PC Specialist, a pretty slim, pretty portable and pretty powerful little laptop. Let's run it through the usual benchmarks and see how it fares. Hi guys, I'm Matt and welcome to Kit Guru. So this is the IONICO 15-inch laptop from PC Specialist. This thing usually retails for £1,847 there or thereabouts over on their website, but it's on sale at the moment, which has seen that price fall to £1,799. That's a saving of 48 quid. You could buy yourself at least one tub of Lurpak butter with that saving, and possibly even a Freddo too. Included in that price, you'll get a 3-year standard warranty, which includes 6 months of collect and return cover, 1 year of parts cover, and 3 years of labour cover. For that 1800 quid, you get the following specs. As I mentioned, the CPU, it's an Intel Core i9-14900HX. It's got 24 cores and 32 threads in total. That's 8 performance cores and 16 efficiency cores. The P cores run at a stated base frequency of 2.2 GHz and can boost up to 5.8 GHz, while the efficiency cores run at 1.6 GHz base and can boost up to 4.1 GHz. The CPU has a base power rating of 55 watts, but it can chug down up to 157 watts if it needs to when boosting. The GPU is the NVIDIA RTX 4070, obviously the laptop version, which is about on par with a 4060 Ti desktop GPU. It's got 8 gigs of GDDR6 memory running over a 128-bit memory bus with a bandwidth of 256 gigabits per second. GPU-Z reports the base clock speed as being 2070 MHz, with the boost clock speed coming in at 2175 MHz. System memory consists of a 32GB kit made up of two 16GB modules of Corsair Vengeance DDR5 running at 5600 megatransfers. Both slots are occupied on the board with memory, so there's no room for adding any more, but with 32GB, I doubt anyone would really want to. I suppose there's an argument to be made that with a CPU such as the i9 that's found in this laptop, creative people or programmers and stuff like that may want to increase to 64GB to deal with memory heavy scenarios like rendering, animation, programming, compiling, that sort of stuff. If that is the case, then a whole new kit would be needed. The display is a 15.3-inch Quad HD LED panel with a 16:10 aspect ratio and a resolution of 2560 by 1600. It's got a matte finish, a 240Hz refresh rate, peak brightness of 500 nits, and stated 100% sRGB coverage. I unfortunately don't have the equipment to measure this display as in-depth as Dom has been doing in some of his recent reviews, but I will tell you this display is as crisp and as vibrant as any I've seen on laptops around this price before. Highly colourful scenes in games and videos have a nice amount of pop and contrast, and I've got no complaints regarding the display whatsoever. Storage was a bit of a weird one. On the spec that I was sent over, it was listed as being a 2TB Solidigm P41 Plus SSD, but upon opening this laptop up, or taking the bottom cover off, it was actually a 2TB Samsung 990 Pro M.2 NVMe SSD. That's a nice upgrade, to be fair, which I'm not sure was done due to stock issues or whether that just needs, the spec list needs updating and it comes with that laptop. I've reached out to PC Specialist and I'll drop any updates or any news on that in the comments when I know, just to let you know what SSD you will get if you choose to pick one of these machines up. Testing the 990 Pro that's found in this laptop with Crystal Diskmark though resulted in read speeds of 7,136 megabytes per second and write speeds of 6,935 megabytes per second. All of those specs that I just mentioned are housed within this full metal chassis. There isn't any specifics about the material that's been used in the spec, but looking online at previous IONICO models, it looks to be a magnesium alloy. It looks and feels really nice, although it is an absolute fingerprint magnet, so it's not going to stay looking very nice for long without some constant microfiber action. Being a 15-inch laptop, it's not massive by any means. It measures around 12mm at its thickest point when closed, and it weighs roughly 2.1 kilograms. It's not the most portable laptop I've ever seen, but it's definitely possible to chuck this thing in a laptop bag and carry it around day to day without doing yourself any major damage. The laptop feels really well made all around. The screen hinges feel smooth and sturdy. The screen folds back almost 180 degrees and it'll stay in place pretty much wherever you want it to. There's a customizable RGB light bar on the underside of the front edge, and that works quite well, and it's quite eye-catching in darker environments. There are a few different lighting modes to choose from within the control center software, which I'll touch on more later in the video when we talk about the power profiles and stuff like that. The keyboard, as you can see, is also backlit, being controlled in the same way as that light bar with that software. It's full-sized, so any numpad enjoyers won't be disappointed. The numpad's over on the right where it usually is. It's quite squashed, but it is there, so if you need one for your work, it's there and you've got it. You won't be missing out. The typing feel is pretty much standard for a laptop. It's nothing to write home about, pardon the pun, but it's not too bad. I personally find typing on a laptop quite satisfying, and it's no different with this IONICO from PC Specialist. The trackpad is a decent size and it's placed centrally under the spacebar. It's tactile and it feels quite nice, but it doesn't register clicks all too well towards the top portion of it. The same as most trackpads. Again, it's okay, but it's nothing out of the ordinary. The speakers continue with this about average trend. They're stereo and the laptop has the Nahimic service installed out of the box. And a lot of people online, I had to mention this, have issues with that driver/service. I've personally never had any issues with it, but it's something that I have to mention in the video. It doesn't get very good feedback or recommendations or comments made about it anywhere you look on the internet. The sound quality coming from the speakers is about what you'd expect from a laptop. It lacks bass, sounds very tinny, and it isn't that loud. I guess it'll do if you're stuck, but if you care about audio quality in the slightest, then plugging some headphones in would lead to a much better experience. Port selection is pretty good on the IONICO. On the left side, there's a pair of USB ports, one type A 3.2 and one type C 3.2, along with a combo headphone/microphone jack. The right side houses a pair of USB type A 3.2 ports and an SD card reader. Then finally on the back, you'll find Thunderbolt 4, HDMI 2.1, a gigabit Ethernet port, and then the power connector. I really like that the power connector's on the back. It's much less likely to get in the way when compared to laptops that have the power cable going into one of the sides. And not necessarily I/O related, but alongside that gigabit network port, the IONICO supports Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.3. So if you're connecting to a capable network, in the terms of the Wi-Fi, then you'd likely stay wireless anyway, because Wi-Fi 6E, if you've got a router that supports it, well, you'll get fast enough speed. You won't really need to plug a cable in. So far, so then. It's a well-built machine that looks and feels good quality. The spec on paper is impressive, so let's see what the IONICO can do. If you're looking for a new chair, then you should definitely check out Booley's. I'm currently sat on their Ninja Pro gaming chair, which is one of 3 models from their gaming series alongside the Elite and the Master. So if you're looking for something new to stick in your setup that you can sit on and game and work, then I recommend definitely checking out booleys.co.uk. Before we dive into the synthetic benchmark charts, let's talk about the power profiles and how I've run this through the benchmarks. I ran this laptop through my selection of benchmarks 3 times in total, using 3 different performance profiles found within the control center software that I mentioned earlier on. Out of the box, the laptop came with a custom Profile 1 active, which places PL1 and PL2 power limits of 75 watts on the CPU. I then created a second custom Profile 2 and I maxed out both of the sliders for PL1 and PL2, raising them both to 140 watts. And finally, I used the preset turbo mode to push the CPU even further and see how well it would perform. Hardware Info constantly reported the power limits as 160 watts for PL1 and 170 watts for PL2, which I'm assuming was coming from the BIOS, as the control center software was overriding the limits displayed in Hardware Info, as can be seen by the CPU hitting 75 watts when running a Cinebench multi-core benchmark with that custom Profile 1 active and the 75 watt PL1 and PL2 power limits. Clock speeds hit the maximum 5.8 GHz at times during benchmarks with that profile active. However, increasing the power available to the CPU did see throttling occur across the two other profiles, with the i9 peaking at 4.5 GHz when running through a Cyberpunk 2077 30-minute stress test with the turbo profile active. But nonetheless, I decided to run the laptop through every single test and benchmark in all three different profiles anyway. Right. With that out of the way, let's have a look at the performance chart, starting with some synthetic benchmarks and see just what this thing can do. Kicking things off with Cinebench multi-core then, and the IONICO 15 when in its turbo profile topped the chart with a Cinebench multi-core score of 29,659, placing it above the Gigabyte Aorus 16X laptop that Dominic reviewed, which has got exactly the same specs as this, exactly the same CPU and GPU. It also finished above the PCSpecialist Recoil 17 RLC that I reviewed a while back, and then it dwarfed the other two profiles, with the out-of-the-box configuration Custom Profile 1 only scoring 21,804 points. Moving on to Cinebench single core then, and the IONICO topped the charts in all three of its profiles, with the turbo profile landing out on top with a score of 2,211 points. Custom Profile 2 recorded 2,201 points, and Custom Profile 1, the out-of-the-box settings, recorded 2,193 points. Looking at GPU performance then in 3D Mark Time Spy, and again the turbo profile saw the IONICO land top of the pile with a score of 13,256 points, whereas the Aorus landed in between Profile 2 and the turbo profile with a score of 13,007, so it was marginal, it wasn't that much of a difference. But again, the out-of-the-box settings landed at bottom of the results with a score of 12,756. And PC Mark 10 then, and again, the turbo profile landed the IONICO 15 at the top of the pile with an overall score of 9,056. The content creation score landed a little bit shy of the Gigabyte laptop that Dominic reviewed, but it was looking around about 350 points difference, so it's nothing major. And the Custom Profile 1 landed above the Razer Blade 16 in its custom profile. So overall, a pretty respectable result for the IONICO PCSpecialist laptop. Lastly then, AIDA64 memory bandwidth, and there was a little bit of a change in the order of results here, with Profile 2 coming out on top, with memory read results of 86,756 megabytes per second and a write speed of 73,576 megabytes per second. So those synthetic benchmark results then show that sticking this thing in its turbo profile usually leads to better CPU performance, which it's providing it with more power, so it was always going to. But if we move on, we'll look at the thermal performance and the noise and stuff like that and see how much of a cost there is at giving the CPU more power. I mentioned the throttling earlier on and showed you some clock speed examples, but now we'll look at how hot this thing got, how loud this thing got, and how much power the CPU used. Kicking the thermals, noise and power section of the video off with the CPU temperature chart then, and we can see that with the turbo profile active in a Cinebench multi-core benchmark run, the IONICO 15 hit a peak temperature on the CPU of 100 degrees, which did lead to the throttling that I mentioned earlier, while in Cyberpunk, over a 30-minute sustained benchmark, that CPU peaked at 93 degrees. The out-of-the-box settings, the Custom Profile 1 in the middle of this chart, we can see that the Cinebench multi-core peak temperature was 94 degrees Celsius, while Cyberpunk 2077 hit 87 degrees, so still quite toasty. And as we've seen before, these really powerful CPUs in laptops do tend to get pretty warm. Let's move on and look at the power consumption. So when idle then, I measured the i9 as using 10 watts of power no matter which profile was selected, but then changing from the out-of-the-box settings saw a bit of a change in things. In the turbo profile, while in Cinebench, that CPU used 120 watts of sustained power. Custom Profile 2 was a little bit less than that in Cinebench at 103 watts, and then in Cyberpunk at 55 watts. And then looking at those PL1 and PL2 power limits that I mentioned earlier of 75 watts. With the out-of-the-box settings, it used exactly that in Cinebench, 75 watts, and then in Cyberpunk 2077, it was 72 watts. And looking at GPU temperatures then, and while these weren't affected too much by switching between the 3 different profiles that I benchmarked, they were high across the board, particularly the memory metric in the turbo profile, hitting a peak measurement of 98 degrees Celsius across a 30-minute sustained stress test in Cyberpunk 2077. The GPU itself got to 87 degrees in that profile, while the hotspot temperature was recorded at 96 degrees, and the temperatures in the other 2 profiles were not too much different at all. And while those temperatures are technically within the safe operating limits of the graphics processor, it is getting a little bit too close to comfort, to the sort of danger zone, and it in no doubt led to the system noise that I'm going to talk about in the next chart. This laptop isn't the quietest ever, but it's nowhere near the loudest either, and it landed there or thereabout the same as the Razer Blade 16 in its custom profile, the Gigabyte Aorus 16X that Dominic reviewed, and then the PCS Recoil 17 RLC on its air cooler that I reviewed a while ago. With the out-of-box settings, in the Cinebench multi-core run, the IONICO hit 51 decibels, and it was exactly the same when I activated Custom Profile 2, and there was an increase of just 1 decibel when I changed to the Turbo Profile, so it's not a massively loud laptop by any means. And looking at battery life then, and with the out-of-the-box settings in the Custom Profile 1, the PCS IONICO recorded a battery life result of 255 minutes when run through the modern office test within PC Mark X. This is quite a disappointing result, but by changing power profiles to balanced and stuff like that, you could easily improve this. But out of the box, you're looking at around 4 hours, just over 4 hours battery life. So there we have it then. That's the synthetic benchmarks and then the thermals, noise and power. So you can see that you can get more performance out of this laptop, the CPU specifically, than you will when it's shipped to you if you choose to pick one up. But it doesn't come for free. It gets very warm when you add or allow the CPU to use more power. So let's move on to gaming and see how this difference in power profiles affected stuff there. And we'll kick things off as we usually do with Cyberpunk 2077 then. And out of the box, we saw average FPS of 45 and a 1% low of 36.5. This was very, very marginally increased by changing to Custom Profile 2 and the Turbo Profile, with the Turbo Profile hitting 47.4 average FPS with a 39.1 1% low. The difference was a bit more noticeable in Company of Heroes, with the Turbo Profile hitting an average FPS of 124.8 with a 1% low of 91.2, probably due to this being an RTS title, so it's a little bit more CPU heavy. The out-of-the-box settings in this title saw average FPS of 116.2 and a 1% low of 87.1. Hogwarts Legacy then, and this was another one where the differences were marginal. With the Turbo Profile active, I saw average FPS of 53 and a 1% low of 29.4. 1% lows were kind of disappointing in this game, with the out-of-the-box settings hitting an average FPS of 50.5, but the 1% low was only 30.4, which was slightly higher than the Turbo Profile, but it's within margin of error. It's 1 FPS different. Shadow of the Tomb Raider then, and again, the differences here were not really noticeable. Day to day, you wouldn't notice them. The Turbo Profile hit 103.5 average FPS with a 1% low of 87.6, while Custom Profile 2 hit 94.6 average FPS with a 1% low of 84.8, and the out-of-the-box Custom Profile 1 settings hit an average FPS of 94.7 with a 1% low of 83.9. The Witcher 3 then, a very demanding game, as we all know. This is on Ultra Plus settings with no ray tracing or upscaling, as are all of the games as we run through these benchmarks. The Turbo Profile saw that IONICO hit average FPS figures of 79.4 with a 1% low of 54.7, while the out-of-the-box settings average FPS was 76.1 and the 1% low was 52.5. Plague Tale Requiem then, and this is a very demanding title, but also one of the best looking games I've ever played. With the Turbo Profile, that kind of reflects how demanding this game is. The average FPS figure only reached 44.5, while the 1% low was 38.2. The out-of-the-box settings were pretty much identical at 44.8 average FPS and a 38.7 1% low. F123 then, the first of the two racing titles that I usually benchmark on games. In the turbo profile, I saw average FPS of 104.4 with a 1% low of 91.4, and pretty similar performance with the out of the box and custom profile 2 settings. Custom profile 1 saw average FPS of 102.1 and 1% low readings of 87.5 FPS. Forza Motorsport then, the other racing title in the lineup of games, and on the turbo profile I saw average FPS of 80.8 with a 1% low figure of 68.6. Custom profile 2 was on average 78.2 FPS with a 1% low of 66.9, and then the out of the box settings custom profile 1 saw an average FPS of 77.2 with a 1% low of 66 on the dot. The penultimate game in the lineup then, Assassin's Creed Mirage, and with the turbo profile I saw average FPS readings of 76.5 with a 1% low of 59.3. When compared with the out of the box settings, it was slightly higher with the turbo profile, with custom profile 1 hitting average FPS figures of 71.9 and 1% low figures of 56.4. Last but not least then, Starfield, quite a demanding title, run at max settings at native resolution, and on the turbo profile I saw the average FPS hit 41.2 with a 1% low reading of 35 FPS. Custom profile 2 saw average FPS figures of 40.9 with 1% lows of 32.8, and custom profile 1 was 42.3, surprisingly higher than the other two power profiles, with 1% low figures of 32.3. And to round out the gaming section then, this is the 10 game average across all 10 games that I benchmarked, giving you a good picture of the overall gaming performance of this laptop. On the turbo profile, I saw average FPS figures of 75.5 with 1% lows of 59.5. Custom profile 2 saw that a little bit lower at 72.4 FPS on average and 57.1 FPS 1% lows. And then out of the box custom profile 1 settings saw FPS figures of 72.1 and 1% low figures of 57.1. So there we have it then. So in conclusion, I feel that the IONICO is a decent laptop. The i9, when running in the out of the box configuration on that custom profile 1, strikes a balance between performance, heat and noise. And while pushing it further with some power limit tweaks, did see a noticeable increase in some benchmark scores. I think in the real world, and if I were using this laptop day to day, I'd just leave it on that custom profile 1. Gaming performance wasn't amazing, but that was never really going to be the case when running every game on maximum settings and using an RTX 4070 laptop GPU. Turning down some settings would definitely be at the top of my list if this was my gaming machine. The build quality of the laptop itself is good. The chassis and the hinges feel really sturdy and robust. The other laptop specific features like the trackpad, speakers, the keyboard, they're all okay. They're nothing amazing, nothing to write home about as I've said earlier in the video, but they all do their jobs well enough. Overall, it's a decent laptop with some serious CPU grunt when it's needed, and it'll handle some pretty demanding gaming when you want to do that too. And that's the end of the video, guys. If you liked it, please leave a like down below. If you want to subscribe to the channel, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. If you go down below the video, you'll find links to our merch store, our Patreon page, our Discord server and our website if you want to check any of that out. Anyway, guys, I've been Matt. This has been the IONICO 15 from PC Specialist. I will speak to you in the next one. Look after yourselves. See you later.